Cisco Firepower and HashiCorp's Terraform series. Infrastructure as code, focusing on day 0 and day 1 deployments. This is pulling it all together. It's going to get fun here. We've got a virtual instance of Firepower that's currently deployed, but we're going to dynamically create a web server on the fly, everything from start to finish, apply the right port groups, configure it to have a web service running, pull some data down, SSH enabled, Firepower. Then we're going to move to create objects that we need for policy to access the web or SSH, or vice versa, going outbound from the DMZ server to get an update from a repository for Ubuntu. You've got all these objects, and then we're going to use those in that access control policy where we've got DMZ zones, outside zones. We've got objects that we're using. You've got destination ports of SSH, HTTP, HTTPS. You've got DNS over UDP. You've got all those URLs that we've created. Wow. And then we've got a default policy of block. We've got IPS policies being applied. We've got logging enabled. And then we move into NAT policy, where we build out a NAT policy to translate that DMZ server out to an external IP address so we can access it, and then allow anything on the DMZ net to get to the internet from a NAT perspective. This is part 1, the code. We've got this main.tf. This is where Firepower Management Provider and API access is configured. You've got your security zones that we're going to reference from Firepower. We're going to read those. Then we've got some default objects, right? HTTP, HTTPS, and SSH. Again, we're going to reference those. Then we have an IPS policy that we will use to attach to an access control policy. Then we move into creating objects, DMZ net, umbrella, DNS provider, internal web, external web. Then you've got your URLs that we're going to access as well. Then we create the blanket access control policy. So this is going to be a block by default. We are going to log here. And then we move into the access control rule. So we've got internet to DMZ, and the action's going to be allowed. And we're going to move into tying these outside and DMZ zones, so source destination zones. You've got source network, destination network, which happens to be the web server. Then you've got destination ports. So we're going to allow HTTP, SSH, and HTTPS, and we're going to apply that IPS policy to it. Next, we move into the next access rule. Again, we create it. It's DMZ to internet DNS. This is going to be from DMZ zone to outside zone, and we're going to take the object of DMZ network and connect to the umbrella IP addresses only using DNS over UDP. Access rule 3, DMZ to internet using HTTP. So in this case, if I need to go out and pull some data down from a repository, I can do that. There's a couple of things that we're going to have here. We're going to only allow access to a couple URLs. So a repo for Ubuntu, both HTTP and HTTPS is an example, those locations, and then YouTube. And we got an IPS policy and a bunch of output. That's access control policy. This is going to be done with a push of a button. Firepower NAT policy. We'll create that base NAT policy, and now we'll create our rules. We've got a manual NAT rule. We've got DMZ to outside. We've got internal and external IPs, and then we've got, web servers, and then we've got our auto NAT rule that's going to take the DMZ network and allow it to translate to that interface. Then we assign it to a device. Now we've got to assign it both access control policy, the device to it, and our NAT policy. So you can see 2 sets of rules here, one for NAT and one for access control. And then we've got some output. Finally, we deploy. Now, you can see here at the end, I was calling a module, but what I found was there could be some delay when policy is ready and I won't get the things created on my web server. So I'm going to use a bash script to delay the start. This is ESX configuration. So again, we get the repository. We can create a virtual switch and port groups. The problem here is I can't find a way to assign the port group to FTD, and it's more to do with the this repository than anything. So I couldn't do that. So I've left the code there, but I'm not leveraging it. Then we've got Cloud-init. Cloud-init's going to allow us to use this user data. We're going to come back to that in a second, but it's going to help us pre-configure. Then we create our specs for our virtual machine. We're using an OVA, and we're assigning the DMZ network to this because we're building this VM from scratch. Now, what is user data? Well, this is cloud config. This is going to allow us to pre-configure that Linux box to add a user named Kali, add the public key so we can SSH directly into it. It's also going to pull down Apache 2. And then as we go along here, you're going to see it's also enabling Apache 2 service and starting that service. Pretty cool. And then I'm actually going out to my YouTube channel to pull down some data to use it as the home page on that web server. Now here's the bash script. So this is allowing me just a little bit more control of when things are being deployed. So I'm going to deploy the firepower stuff, do all the changes, push policy, and I'm going to wait 10 minutes before I deploy the web server. And then the web server is going to ensure that the policy is pushed and has access to the internet. It's going to get an IP address. It's going to get natted. The access rules are going to work, and the lab will be finally provisioned for us to test.